Welcome to the KR Queen channel, where I evaluate complex questions and present the results to you as though to a jury. Hey everyone, my name is Corey Queen. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and before law school I was a campus minister at the University of Tennessee. And in 1997, the London Times ran a poll for readers to vote on the best book of the 20th century. And you guessed it, the winner was Lord of the Rings. But you know who didn't guess it? The highbrow readers who call themselves literary critics and whom many others call the chattering class. Not to say critics are all bad. Tolkien's good friend C.S. Lewis was one of the very best critics of his day and wrote some excellent reviews of Tolkien's work. And in fact, he made this prophetic prediction. I have little doubt that the book will soon take its place among the indispensables. But many other critics were not so favorable. They called The Lord of the Rings simplistic, naive, sexist. They said its main characters were all one-dimensional, morally black and white. They said it was boring, entirely too long and meandering. And these critics were scandalized to discover that the ordinary readers who took the London Times poll evidently didn't notice all these shortcomings. But that was just the beginning. 2 years later, in 1999, Amazon.com ran a poll for its readers to vote on the best book of the entire millennium, and the scandal grew even worse. Lord of the Rings won that as well. Have you ever noticed that the literary critics, and nowadays that would include Hollywood, the elites who control most of our on-screen storytelling, rarely seem to have their finger on the pulse of the human heart? Just look at the all too common flops like the recent Snow White movie. Here's an IMDb review that really got me on that one. Rachel Zegler takes on the role of Snow White, though you'd be forgiven for thinking she was actually playing a medieval TED Talk speaker. Instead of the wide-eyed, kind-hearted princess we all knew, this Snow White is a strong, independent woman, trademark, because saying, "I want to be a queen, not a bride," apparently counts as character development these days. Disney thought it would be a good idea to rewrite Snow White, keep the costumes, replace the themes, never suspecting that by doing so they were emptying the story of everything people loved about it. A wax figure may look pretty convincing, but it's all form and no substance, and we all know the real thing when we see it. Meanwhile, Peter Jackson's cinematic portrayals of Lord of the Rings, which were largely faithful to the source material, remain arguably the most celebrated movies in the history of cinema. But here's something that many people don't realize. When Lord of the Rings was written, it was already audaciously countercultural. Tolkien's critics have been calling Lord of the Rings outdated from the moment it hit the shelves. Those of us who love Lord of the Rings know the story isn't outdated, it's timeless. Those who call it dated might as well call water dated and advise us to drink Coca-Cola instead. After all, Coca-Cola is much newer, much more cutting edge, and these critics seem to think that being new is somehow a virtue in itself. Most of us know better. There are some things that have always promoted human flourishing and always will, regardless of whatever modern fads rise and fall around them. The words new and improved are not synonyms. At any rate, countless writers since Tolkien have attempted to replicate or even improve on his work, especially in the fantasy genre. Some are better than others, but they all seem to be missing something. Most famously, George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire and the Game of Thrones TV series that came out of it. One writer for Time magazine even called Martin an American Tolkien, which is what I like to call an unfortunate misnomer. Not because Martin isn't talented, he's very talented, but because Martin is an atheist and writes his very grim, brutal, hopeless story out of that worldview, and it's all soaked in a sexual mania that would make Freud blush. Calling Martin the American Tolkien is like calling Billy Graham the American Dawkins. Sure, broadly speaking, they comment publicly on religion, but that is where their commonalities end. Similarly, Martin and Tolkien write medieval high fantasy stories. Beyond that, they might as well be from different planets. In fact, Martin and Tolkien are from different planets, at least in their own minds. Tolkien was devoutly Christian and wrote his story out of a worldview that faces suffering with hope, whereas Martin writes his stories out of the harsh, meaningless realities of the godless universe that he believes he lives in. Now, I should point out here that it would be naive to think that Martin or any other grim, dark, or postmodern writer knows something about the harshness of reality that Tolkien didn't know. Tolkien inhabited an Oxford University culture that was already deeply entrenched in atheism by the time he showed up, and he was a world-class intellectual long before he wrote Lord of the Rings. He was philosophically astute enough to help convert another world-class intellectual, fellow Oxford professor C.S. Lewis, out of atheism, and Tolkien experienced firsthand the horrors of trench warfare during World War I and was only 12 years old when he lost his mother. In sum, Tolkien possessed world-class brilliance and was intimately acquainted with loss and suffering. So let's not be ridiculous and insinuate that any of these grim, morally gray postmodern writers understand something about the harshness of reality that Tolkien didn't know. That would indeed be a very naive assumption. Lord of the Rings is what happens when you take a world-class intellectual like Tolkien, put him through profound suffering and loss, and then give him decades to meticulously craft a story out of that material. Lewis himself, also a veteran of the trenches, wrote this about Tolkien's work. As we read, we find ourselves sharing their burden. When we have finished, we return to our life not relaxed, but fortified. Lewis knew a timeless, fortifying story when he saw one. Most critics don't. Most of us do. But that's enough for introductions. Tolkien is timeless. So let's go on an adventure and explore the philosophy of Middle-earth, and along the way, I think we'll find the answer to why Tolkien is timeless. For this discussion, we'll examine two aspects of Tolkien's philosophy and how they play out in Middle-earth. We'll examine his metaphysics and his ethics. In other words, his views on what the world is really like, metaphysics, and his views on what a person should do about it, ethics. We'll start with metaphysics, and the most obvious metaphysical reality in Middle-earth is that it was created by Eru Iluvatar. In Christian theology, that would be simply God. We start here because it is foundational. All other ideas build on this. Tolkien himself said it this way in one of his letters. I have deliberately written a tale which is built on or out of certain religious ideas, but is not an allegory of them. In a different letter, he wrote that The Lord of the Rings is about God and his sole right to divine honor. And Tolkien set this idea in contrast to Sauron, who sought God's honor for himself. Now, a person could wonder, how important can this God figure be when he's never expressly mentioned in The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings? But this question betrays a misunderstanding about foundational ideas. The fact that Middle-earth is created by a good, loving, all-powerful God is the fountainhead of everything that happens in the story. Not a leaf rustles in all of Middle-earth that the sovereign creator does not oversee. Everything has meaning. Everything comes within the purview of the divine purpose. Unlike an atheistic universe, life in Middle-earth is not simply a nasty, brutish, and short accidental arrangement of atoms. When you drill down to the very base level of reality in Middle-earth, there is a person waiting for you there who can say, I am, as in, I am the one and only thing that exists simply because it exists. Matter is not the basic fact of reality. A person is. And as we progress, notice how not a single idea from here on out is untouched by this foundational idea that Middle-earth is a world created and overseen by a creator. That brings us to the second metaphysical reality, which is that Middle-earth was not just created, it was sung into existence. Middle-earth is brimming with music. The characters are always breaking out into songs that tell stories, carry memories, or simply praise the natural beauties around them. In this way, Middle-earth is like Narnia, which was also sung into existence. And yet again, we see a foundational metaphysical concept that leaves no part of the world untouched. Just as Iluvatar purposed to create Middle-earth, and Middle-earth is therefore full of purpose and meaning, Middle-earth was sung into existence, and so the world is full of music. When Sam walks into Lothlorien with great wonder and says, I feel as if I was inside a song if you take my meaning, he speaks with greater wisdom than he knows. Sam often does that. But here's a really interesting feature of the song that created Middle-earth. The Ainur, who are basically angels, sang Middle-earth into existence, but one of them, Melkor, by an act of pride and self-worship, struck out on his own and intentionally wove discord into the music, inserting his own independent notes that did not harmonize with the rest. In doing so, he became the Satan figure of Middle-earth. This is a profound idea, by which I mean it is deeply true. For one, it illustrates the baseline harmony of reality. A central Christian idea is that we're made in the image of God, Imago Dei. But another central Christian idea is that God is a Trinity, three persons existing in such perfect unity and harmony that it is no contradiction to call them one. So I mentioned earlier that when you drill down to the base level of reality, you will find God there at the center of all things, the one basic fact that everything else flows out of, and this God is a Trinity, an eternal relationship. What words or symbols could possibly convey this idea? It is the original art, the distinct colors of a painting combining in harmony to create a beautiful image. It's the original song, the distinct notes in a symphony combining in harmony to create beautiful music. To say that Middle-earth was sung into existence touches on this extraordinary idea that every act of creation, all art and music, are echoes of the harmony flowing out of the original perfect harmony, the Trinity, because the Trinity exists as a sort of living symphony, distinct notes, but all in harmony. Let's take it a step further. Like the angels, we have a choice. We can join in that eternal song and be swept up into the life of the Trinity in harmony with God and angels and man, or we can fall into self-worship like Melkor or Satan, write our own music, our own rules for good and evil, precisely what the serpent offered Eve in the garden in Genesis. But when we do so, we fall out of harmony and into the isolation, loneliness, and despair that necessarily follow. We'll go into more detail on that in the fellowship section. But for now, notice too that Melkor's choice to weave his own discord into heaven's music caused his influence to be woven into creation itself. Here is an answer to the perennial problem of evil. Why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Free will has always been a key part of the Christian answer to that question, but not merely human free will. Angels have it too, and those who freely turned away from God and into self-worship were cast to earth, where they cause immense harm and suffering, weaving discord into the harmony of creation. Of course, we can take it a step deeper and ask, but why did God allow the angels to go bad in the first place, and why send them to earth? The Christian answer has always been the same. God knew that greater good would result from making creatures who were free to choose good or evil than if he hadn't made them. Temporary evils are permitted on the road to even greater goods. Or, Tolkien put it this way in one of his letters, I sometimes feel appalled at the thought of the sum total of human misery. If anguish were visible, almost the whole of this benighted planet would be enveloped in a dense dark vapor. But evil labors with vast power and perpetual success in vain, preparing always only the soil for unexpected good to sprout in. That's it. That's the answer. And at that point, there's no sense in asking a further why. Why didn't God do it this way? Couldn't he have accomplished his goals with less suffering, and so on? Those questions are really just ways of saying, if I were God, I would have done it differently. The sheer arrogance of deposing God in this way speaks for itself, as if we have anything but the tiniest glimpse of what goes on even on our observable earth, much less in the vastness of heaven. At some point, the creature must make a choice, accept the notes assigned to him that will place him in harmony with God and his people, or instead listen to the serpent and write the rules of right and wrong, good and evil for ourselves, sing our own notes. That is the creature's choice. It is the choice. Let God be God, or try and replace him. So as we proceed, you will notice that yet again, the symphony of Middle-earth begins in heaven and cascades from there into everything else, just as those with ears for it in our world can hear the musica universalis, music of the spheres, echoing throughout all human history to this day. The third metaphysical reality in Middle-earth is what you might consider some more specific notes out of the heavenly symphony. I'm talking about archetypes and moral norms, or to put it in more general language, I'm talking about Platonic ideas. One of the most striking things about Middle-earth is that it doesn't just feel real, it often feels even more real than our own world. Peter Kraft put it this way in his book on the philosophy of Tolkien. In The Lord of the Rings, everything seems to be more itself, more Platonic. The earth is more earthy, nature is more natural, the history is more historical, the genealogy is more genealogical, the tragedy more tragic, the joy more joyful, the caverns more cavernous, the forests more foresty, and the heroes more heroic. At the end of the Chronicles of Narnia, there's a unicorn who steps into paradise and says something very similar. I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I have been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. The reason why we loved the old Narnia is that it sometimes looked a little like this. So here we have this distinction between the world I can see and touch versus an unseen world that yet somehow feels even more real than the one I'm standing in. What accounts for this? That's where the concept of Platonic ideas comes in. So let's make sure we understand this concept. To do so, we first have to clarify some other categories. First, there are objects, a table, a book, a rock. So they are objective. They exist outside of us regardless of what we think about them. If a book falls on my head, it will hit me regardless of my opinion on the matter. The impact will be an objective reality. The object hit me. But it would be an objective reality that I, the subject, experienced. So there are subjective events that depend on the subject. What I think, feel, experience, it's all subjective. I'm the subject that you might say produces or experiences them. And then you can add some additional nuance to this by observing that I, the subject, have a body in my possession, that I can move around more or less at will, making my body a sort of subjective object. I, the subject, control this object. Conversely, there are other people, other selves out there who experience everything subjectively. Only they, and not I, am the subject from their perspective. So that makes other people objective subjects, as in they are objective in the sense of being external to me and operating totally independently of what I think, but they are subjects from their own perspective. So we have 4 categories: objects, book; subjects, me; subjective objects, my body; objective subjects, you. Platonic ideas are a 5th category. There are realities that a person can discover in their mind but cannot sense in any physical way. The most obvious one is moral principles. If we find out someone snatched up a bunch of live cats and tried out all the various ways there apparently are to skin a cat, the morally sane person knows the wrongness of it without question. It is wrong. It violates a rule that we cannot see or scientifically measure, but every morally sane person knows it as surely as they know they have a heart beating in their own chest and a brain in their skull. But Platonic ideas don't have to be moral. On Plato's thinking, there's such a thing as an ideal triangle, for instance, that forms a sort of blueprint in our mind, so that even if we draw the triangle imperfectly on a whiteboard, we know what the drawing is intended to convey and use that unseen triangle as a point of reference for the one on the whiteboard. This concept of a blueprint, a deep unseen essence of a thing, can run from triangles to moral rules to personality archetypes. This is what Carl Jung's groundbreaking work on the collective unconscious was getting at. Jung's decades of therapeutic practice gave him keen insight into the subjective experiences of countless patients, and when he combined this insight with his deep knowledge of philosophy and mythology, he found that certain symbols and personality archetypes seemed to exist independently of any one person, even across cultural boundaries. Like the rules of morality, the same personality archetypes show up again and again in every culture. The archetypal hero is a popular one, for instance, as evidenced by the title of Joseph Campbell's most famous work, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Yet another hint at the Platonic idea of a hero, the archetypal hero who exists independently of any one person, 1,000 faces for the same underlying form, a blueprint none of us can see, yet so many of us seem to innately grasp like an objective truth. You can't put skinning cats as wrong or heroes sacrifice themselves for the good of others in a laboratory and measure them. And yet we know those statements to be true with airtight certainty. With that framework in mind, let's return to the question: how is it that Lord of the Rings often feels even more real than our tangible world? Well, Tolkien understood what Plato understood and what atheists don't, that nature, myths, heroes, they aren't just surprising accidental iterations of dust and atoms. They mean something, and the blueprint for what they mean, while invisible, is perceptible to those of us who are looking for it, those of us who don't blind ourselves with the dogma of materialism. You might put it in the terminology of St. Paul and say they have spiritual eyes and so can perceive spiritual things. Tolkien himself claimed he didn't merely write Lord of the Rings, he discovered it. And because he had such a keen perception of the unseen world that underlies the visible one, he was able to relay his impressive vision to us via the most reliable vehicle for deeper truths known to man, mythology. Just as Jesus put his most powerful life lessons into stories that allowed his listeners not simply to hear the truth, but to experience it, Tolkien conveyed his immense wisdom about what the world is really like through a story that is, in many ways, even more real than the world that we can see and touch. Aragorn is not just a king, he is the archetypal king, the king with 1,000 faces. Lothlorien is not just a pretty forest, it is the archetype of that elusive magic that many of us experience early in life and persistently long for from then on, a magic that the post-industrial world is doing its best to cut down and chase away. Éowyn is not just a rebellious princess, she is the archetypal blend of strength and beauty, a sort of Joan of Arc who refuses to let cultural norms restrain her from being who she's meant to be. This is one of the most impressive things about Tolkien. He seemed to understand the deepest essence of everything he wrote about. Everything King Midas touched turned to gold, cold and lifeless. Tolkien is the opposite. Everything he touched sprang to life. And returning to morality, it's another thing people perceive without difficulty, even though it's invisible. People across all time and cultures have understood that certain behaviors are right and others are wrong. Tolkien was morally sane and believed the same thing, but since moral subjectivism still holds plenty of sway in our society, Tolkien is still frequently mischaracterized as morally simplistic. Postmodernism was well underway by the time Lord of the Rings was published, so Tolkien immediately received the feedback that the story is black and white, good versus evil, with straightforward good guys and bad guys, naively simplistic, and so on. First of all, I, like Tolkien and Lewis, cannot imagine how anyone who actually read and paid attention to the story could ever say this. Gollum's internal battle, Boromir's back and forth between heroism and obsession with the ring, Denethor's very nuanced downfall, particularly in the books, Frodo's refusal to discard the ring at the end so that it's only by the sovereignty of higher powers that the ring is even destroyed. It is flat wrong to claim Tolkien's characters are black and white. Even Sauron has good intentions at first. It is not Tolkien's characters that are black and white. It is his morals. In Tolkien's world, mercy, love, and kindness really are good. Exploitation, hatred, and self-worship really are evil. In other words, he remained a Christian and didn't buy into the postmodern dogma that moral grayness is somehow the only virtue that's left. Those who have bought into that dogma tend to fault Tolkien for drawing clear moral lines. They even talk about him as though he's the naive old grandfather of fantasy literature who just didn't understand the world the way that we do now. And I'll say once again, the real naivety is to assume that Tolkien, the world-class intellectual and veteran of the trenches, didn't understand the postmodern trends he was actively resisting, as if Nietzsche-loving Nazis of his day were not an excellent example of postmodern moral relativism hard at work. Tolkien knew exactly what he was doing, and his story is such a lifeline for so many people precisely because he did it. So in summary, there's a straightforward answer to why Middle-earth feels more real than the world we live in. Because it is. Perhaps you find this surprising. Well, to quote Narnia's Professor Diggory when everyone is surprised to find paradise even realer than Earth, it's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? So much for metaphysical features of the Middle-earth philosophy. We'll now move into part 2, ethical features. So again, we've talked about metaphysics, what the world is really like, and now we'll go into ethics, what a person should do about it. And the first ethical feature of Middle-earth plays out at the broadest level in the plot structure. The plot is very unusual because it is an anti-quest. The classical quest plot structure is a tried and true method. The hero leaves the safety of home to find and acquire something, a magic sword, a pile of treasure, whatever. Lord of the Rings is unique in that we begin the story with the item already in our possession, and the entire plot centers around destroying it, hence an anti-quest, a quest to lose rather than gain something. This is such an upside-down idea, very unique in the history of literature, very creative. The idea that our greatest victory can only come by losing something, and not just anything. The ring is a constant temptation. When you're with the ring, you want it. You crave it. You become obsessed with it. The longer you're under its influence, the more it affects you, the harder it is to give it up. But what does the ring offer? Well, it offers whatever you love, but to excess. For Sauron, that's power. For Boromir, it's glory, the opportunity to be the noble hero who rescues his kingdom. For Sam, a simple gardener, the ring tempts him with a garden that covers the whole earth, and it all belongs to him. But notice, not one of these things is inherently evil. Power, glory, gardens, they're not bad in themselves. In fact, God offers all of the same things, but they become bad when they occupy more of our time, energy, and attention than they deserve. In other words, when our affections become inordinate, out of order, out of harmony. When we fixate on the good to the exclusion of the great, that's when evil comes in. In fact, Tolkien, like Augustine, believed that sin and evil do not exist in themselves. God does not make anything that's inherently evil. Sin and evil are God's good creations, twisted out of shape. All devils were angels first, and all bad urges are actually just good urges, twisted out of shape. Frodo says it this way, describing orcs. The shadow that bred them can only mock, it cannot make. Not real new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs. It only ruined them and twisted them. So the temptation from the ring is always the same, to twist things out of shape, to worship the lesser to the exclusion of the greater. And the only path out of this temptation is to give up the thing you want entirely. Power, glory, dreams of the perfect garden, give it up. Or in Jesus' words, die to it. Jesus said, "The one who seeks his life will lose it. The one who loses his life for my sake will find it." He also said, "If any would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." So do you see the connection? The entire Christian life, like Lord of the Rings, is an anti-quest, laying down everything, our entire life at God's feet, because he is the greatest thing, and trusting that he's the only one who can take our inordinate mess of a life and set it right. The ring, on the other hand, represents so many obstacles to the Christian lifestyle. It presents like an addiction, like slavery to our appetites, whether that's drugs, sex, pornography, food, alcohol, and Gollum is your classic addict. Far from happy, even when he has the object of his addiction, or I would even say he's especially unhappy when he has it. But he will lie, steal, and kill to get it. And even when he wants to be free from it, or at least wants to want to be free from it, like Bilbo, he can never fully discard its influence. Like with real addictions, the only way to beat the ring is by a higher power. That's how the ring is ultimately destroyed. Again, no individual hero does it. An unseen sovereign power orchestrates its destruction, and it is a well-documented real-world phenomenon that leaning on a higher power is the only reliable way to beat addiction. Karl Marx famously called religion the opiate of the masses, but it turns out that religion is the most reliable tool for getting people off of opiates. But it's not just addiction. The ring also presents like wealth because, like money, the ring's not a real thing at all. It's purely a means of getting what you want. You can't eat money. It's not beautiful. You can't build anything with it. Like the ring, it is purely a means of power, a means of getting something you want or think you want. The great con is that the ring never satisfies you. Like wealth and salt water, the more you drink, the thirstier you become, the more you wither and fade.
I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread.
And finally, the ring presents like technology, because like technology, it is a way of externalizing our power, putting our power into something outside of us, and in doing so, weakening the wielder. Sauron gains immense power with the ring, but when the ring is destroyed, he's reduced to nothing more than a shadow. And look at what the ring did to Gollum. Reduced him to a groveling worm of a creature who often refers to both the ring and himself as precious, because he no longer knows where the ring ends and Gollum begins. He thought he was taking the ring, but the ring was taking him. Technology is like that. Just look at the devastating effects of smartphones. Never in the history of the world has so much information been instantly available to the average person. These devices have unprecedented computational power. And what happened when we got them? Mental illness skyrocketed. Anxiety, depression, self-harm like never before. Pornography addiction, higher than ever. Attention spans, shorter than ever. For many, if not most people, their phone is the first thing they look at in the morning and the last thing they look at before going to sleep, and it occupies many hours in between. And how interesting that the symbol of that addictive technology is an apple with a bite taken out of it. Does that sound a little bit like Genesis? We thought we were taking hold of great technological power, but no, the technology has taken hold of us. Almost everyone has a ring in their pockets now.
What has it got in its pockets?
Are we stronger, smarter, happier? Not at all. By externalizing our power and placing it in technology, we've weakened ourselves on virtually every front. We're not even more connected. We could talk to anyone instantly, and yet somehow study after study is showing us to be lonelier, more emotionally frail, and less socially skilled than we've ever been. When we externalized our power by placing it in technology, we lost that power. And imagine what would happen if the internet were thrown into the cracks of doom and vanished tomorrow. How many of us, like Sauron, would feel like pale shadows of ourselves? How many of us, like Gollum, can't quite tell where our self ends and our technology begins? Our social media profiles, our games, our apps. Wouldn't losing them feel like losing a part of ourselves? In this brave new world we're building with all the industry of Isengard, we are creating unheard of problems. Unheard of, but not unpredicted. One of the most brilliant things about the ring is how well it symbolizes such a variety of temptations all in one. It is the very essence of sin, bait intended to hook and enslave us. In fact, there's an interesting tension in the Christian life between freedom and self-control, and look at how the ring reflects this idea. When the ring is nearby, as I mentioned, you want it. So it is compatible with the idea of freedom for you to take the ring and use it. After all, that is what you want. But then you're worse off than you were before. You need the ring more and more. You become a slave to it. So can that really be called freedom? One of the common Greek words for freedom is anomia, lawlessness, doing whatever you want because you want to. That too is sin and salt water. And the Bible often refers to sin as something that enslaves. So you can be enslaved by lawlessness, enslaved by doing whatever you want. Here is one of the great paradoxes of the Christian life, that the only true freedom in life is the freedom to lay down our rights, desires, happiness, and in summary, our life at the foot of the cross. Our only true freedom is slavery to Christ. Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. We'll be enslaved to something. We have no choice in the matter. So we can be enslaved to Christ, who made us and knows what we need and loves us even better than we can love ourselves, or we can be enslaved to our own cravings and desires. In other words, to Satan, who hates us and wants nothing but suffering for us. That's the choice. Slavery to Iluvatar or the ring, to Christ or sin. Those are the two options. It really is that black and white. The etymology of the word freedom is actually instructive here too. The free in freedom is just what it sounds like. Unfettered, you can do whatever you want. The dom, D-O-M, in freedom means essentially outcome. It's the same Latin root as the word doom. Do we think Tolkien, the world-class linguist, understood this? You tell me. Here's a quote from Lord of the Rings. Éomer asks Aragorn, what doom do you bring out of the north? The doom of choice, said Aragorn. Freedom is free doom, our ability to freely destroy ourselves if we so choose, or, if we're wise, to freely entrust the outcome to someone higher than ourselves. The entire Christian life, like the entire plot of Lord of the Rings, is an anti-quest in which we freely decide whether to take power into our own hands or offer it to Christ, who sets the captives free. The doom we carry in this anti-quest is the doom of choice. The next ethical feature in Middle-earth is a concept coined by Tolkien, and it's called Northern Courage. It essentially means courage when the odds are impossibly against you. It also means doing what's right, even when it makes no practical sense to do so. Tolkien called it Northern Courage because he associated it with the myths of Northern Europe, especially Norse mythology and Beowulf, and their depictions of reckless, heroic bravery. This is a key place where Tolkien and modern grimdarkers like George R.R. Martin widely differ. Because Tolkien believes in a higher power, he entrusts everything to that power. We do what's right because it is right, even when we can't see where things are headed, because we trust God with the outcome. Martin doesn't believe in a higher power, so his characters must ultimately trust themselves more than anything. Everything in his world is subjective, which includes moral subjectivism. We do what's right if it will help us, the subjects, achieve our goals. Or to put it in biblical language, everyone does what's right in his own eyes. Tolkien's Northern Courage, on the other hand, doing what's right because it is right, is seen as naive in a postmodern materialist world. For example, I think the Lit Charts website did a good job of summarizing the Game of Thrones ethic, which is a common postmodern ethic. In essence, the novel argues that while honor and integrity are laudable qualities, in the arena of politics and power, relying on integrity can be short-sighted and naive, and it can undermine one's ability to achieve honorable goals. Instead of relying solely on a sense of right and wrong to realize one's goals, one must rely on cunning and intelligence to decipher the motives of those nearby in order to deploy honor and integrity in strategic ways. So with Martin and many other postmodern writers, we begin with a subjective goal, and then we decide whether we think honor or integrity are likely to help us reach that goal. And if not, if the two conflict, if we think it's impossible or unlikely that doing what's right will help us achieve our goal, then we don't do what's right. It's straightforward postmodern relativism. It's the exact opposite of Tolkien's Northern Courage. But Northern Courage is a key reason that The Lord of the Rings is so beautiful and impactful. Consider this famous passage from near the end. When Sam and Frodo are deep into enemy territory, they're surrounded by powerful enemies, they're exhausted, they're confident they'll never make it out alive, even if they do succeed in destroying the ring. And in the midst of that darkness and hopelessness, we get this passage. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. His song in the tower had been defiance rather than hope, for then he was thinking of himself. Now, for a moment, his own fate and even his master's ceased to trouble him. He crawled back into the brambles and laid himself beside Frodo's side, and putting away all fear, he cast himself into a deep, untroubled sleep. Tim Keller, that eloquent, deep-thinking Christian speaker, once went into a high-risk surgery, and there was a passage that he said he clung to as he was about to go under. You would think it would have been a passage from the Bible, but no, he said that the passage that brought him the most comfort was the one I just read. It beautifully captures the Christian hope. But let's say one of these postmodern atheists were to write the same passage. Let's set aside the fact that Frodo and Sam never would have gone into Mordor in the first place on their worldview. It's much too risky, much too naive for a couple of hobbits, such small people, to think they could accomplish such a feat. But let's set that aside and assume we reach that famous passage I just read. What might the postmodernist like Martin write? There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and despair returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, that light was only a small and passing thing. The shadows would eventually engulf all light and all life, leaving the universe in cold darkness. His song in the tower had been defiance rather than hope, for then he was thinking of himself. That was wise. Now, for a moment, his own fate and even his master's were clear. Sooner or later, they would both perish and be lost forever, and the universe would perish soon after. So what difference did their quest really make? He crawled back into the brambles and laid himself close to Frodo, but not so close that he wouldn't have time to react if Frodo tried to betray him for some morally subjective reason. Putting away all peace, he cast himself into a deeply troubled sleep. Inspiring. It is interesting on this note how spectacularly the Game of Thrones flopped at the end, and I have some thoughts about why, but just look at the reviews. It's going strong for seasons 1 through 7, and then season 8, the final season, reviews plummet. The last episode on IMDb got a 4 out of 10 rating. David Sims, writing for The Atlantic, wrote of the final season, "I'm genuinely happy that there are folks who don't feel as though the hours and hours they've devoted to this show have been wasted. I know there are many others who wish they could say the same." These are brutal reviews, but I don't envy Martin his task. Skillful as he is, and he truly is an exceptional writer, he had to avoid making people feel like all their time on the show was wasted when he believes that all life is a grand pointless accident. How do you write a satisfying epic out of that? I can't tell you. I've never read one. Tolkien's story, on the other hand, rises like a song into a mighty crescendo of northern courage on multiple fronts against impossible odds. Only we knew the whole time that the odds weren't actually impossible. We always knew the light would drive away the darkness and that we were on the winning side. The only true impossibility was that the darkness would prevail. Everyone knew that from the beginning, and it gave them courage. You might think this would remove all suspense from the tale, but no, it simply adds to its beauty and impact because it is so deeply true to the human experience. As philosopher and Tolkien enthusiast Peter Kraft observed, hope for the task depends on trust in the taskmaster. So it is important to note, Northern courage isn't just some generalized feeling that something good will happen. Northern courage flows out of trust in higher powers. It's not blind at all. It's the opposite of blindness. Unlike materialists, Northern courage sees beyond the dust beneath our feet and trusts more than merely ourselves. It's the materialists who refuse to look at anything they can't wrap their finite minds around, and it is they who therefore walk around fixated on matter and blind to what matters. Northern courage knows, with Plato, that the unseen is realer than the seen. Northern courage knows, with Christians, that God can split the sea, topple giants, and raise the dead, and that he often shows up most spectacularly precisely when all hope seems lost. Those who understand this can, with Sam, lay down, surrounded by darkness and danger, and sleep in peace. Their peace can only be described as supernatural, or in the words of St. Paul, it is peace that surpasses understanding. It's like one of my favorite Psalms. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord guards the city, the guard keeps watch in vain. It is vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives sleep to his beloved. And Northern courage isn't merely peaceful either. Another common feeling, if you will, that accompanies Northern courage is joy. One of my favorite passages in Lord of the Rings is an exchange between Pippin and Gandalf before the siege of Gondor begins in Return of the King. Here it is. "Are you angry with me, Gandalf?" Pippin said as their guide went out and closed the door. "I did the best I could." "You did indeed," said Gandalf, laughing suddenly, and he came and stood beside Pippin, putting his arm about the hobbit's shoulders and gazing out of the window. Pippin glanced in some wonder at the face now close beside his own, for the sound of that laugh had been gay and merry. Yet in the wizard's face he saw at first only lines of care and sorrow, though as he looked more intently he perceived that under all there was a great joy, a fountain of mirth, enough to set a kingdom laughing were it to gush forth. In this passage, Gandalf is standing face to face with darkness. A massive hostile army is approaching, and there is no reason to think anyone in the city will get out alive. Gandalf stands in what Psalm 23 calls the valley of the shadow of death. But as Charles Spurgeon pointed out, all that remains of death is indeed a shadow. Jesus stole the substance of death. Only a shadow remains. And who's ever been hurt by a shadow? In the New Testament, Paul and Silas sing in prison before the blood has even had time to dry from a brutal flogging, even though they had no idea what further brutalities might lie ahead. And they suffer with such joy because the outcome is safely out of their hands and in the hands of the one that they trust completely. Gandalf, with a similar trust, faces the siege of Gondor with enough joy inside to set a whole kingdom laughing. And don't get me wrong, Northern Courage is serious. It's on a mission. The only reason we can even call it courage is because it actively faces hard, dangerous, painful situations. But the paradox of Northern Courage is that it is peaceful with supernatural peace and joyful with supernatural joy because it knows with supernatural certainty that heaven has spoken and the victory is already won. Our job is simply to perform whatever part has been assigned to us today, here and now, to see that victory to completion, and let tomorrow worry about itself. That's what Northern Courage looks like. This brings us to the final ethical feature of Middle-earth, which is fellowship. And here's where Tolkien's depth really blows me away. I've loved Lord of the Rings since I was in elementary school, but for a while, something that bothered me about it was the lack of a clear-cut hero. It's not like Batman or Ender's Game or Sherlock Holmes where there's this one exceptional standout character who saves the day. Many times, especially in my late teens and early 20s, I wanted Gandalf, for instance, to really show out and win the day, but he always seemed to hold back and let others do what he could have done better, and this bothered me. I've since learned that this discomfort was not a flaw in the story, but rather the story exposing a flaw in me. See, Lord of the Rings is never more Christian than in its treatment of heroes, because everyone in the story can play their part and share in the heroism. Christ is the hero of Christianity, but the word Christian, Christian, literally means little Christ. Every Christian is called by Jesus to deny self, take up their cross, and follow him, for the good of everyone around them. In essence, to act heroically, to be little Christs, little heroes. But what does this have to do with fellowship? Well, consider this. The Battle of the Ring is described at the broadest level as a contest between Sauron and Gandalf. Gandalf was sent specifically to oppose Sauron, and notice the difference between their methods. Sauron's method is to bend everyone that he can to his will and force them to comply like a hive of insects. Everyone is a tool for his purposes, nothing more. Gandalf's method is to coax the strength, willpower, and sense of unique individual purpose out of everyone that he can to create a harmonious fellowship, a team of heroes who all love and respect each other. He doesn't control them like tools, he cultivates them like a garden. This is how the church works. We are made in the image of a Trinitarian God, an eternal relationship, and the ultimate goal is to see us join in the song of heaven and live in harmony with God and each other. Every note from every person distinct, yet in harmony with the collective song. A one-note song can never be as beautiful as a symphony. So when I was younger, I wanted Tolkien to give us a standout hero, a one-note song. But instead, he gave us this symphony that reflects the very deepest reality. We are all, from small to great, hobbits to angels, meant to sing our own unique note in harmony with the eternal song of heaven. That's what we're all made for. Conversely, Melkor's and then Sauron's influence, like the influence of Satan, leaves a person isolated, lonely, bitter, angry, sad, insistent on his own way to the exclusion of everyone else. It is indeed a miserable, hellish existence. All throughout Lord of the Rings, the slaves of evil can be kept mostly submissive by fear and self-preservation, but they're always fighting amongst themselves. They're self-centered, egotistical, genuine products of Melkor and Sauron, discordant with everything and everyone around them, only ever concerned about what's in it for me. And a house like that that's divided against itself can't stand. The joyful alternative is unity in diversity, life in harmony, loving our neighbors as ourselves. In short, fellowship. And some of the richest moments in Lord of the Rings are simple moments of love, honor, mercy, respect, the simple harmony of neighborly fellowship that reflects the grand eternal harmony of heaven, a taste of what paradise will be like. So there you have it, 6 features of the philosophy of Middle-earth that I hope have shed some light for you on why Tolkien is timeless. So God bless you as you join the worldwide fellowship and find your own unique note to sing in heaven's eternal song, and I'll see you next time.